Introduction. A meme quoting Einstein's comments on Lenin gives the false impression of uncritical support. The meme says, quote, "I honor Lenin as a man who completely sacrificed himself and devoted all his energy to the realization of social justice," end quote. Then there's an ellipsis showing some text has been removed, and the quotation continues, quote, "One thing is certain, men of his type are the guardians and restorers of humanity," end quote. However, while Einstein held Lenin in great admiration, and he himself identified as a socialist, this meme deliberately distorts Einstein's comment by suppressing an important part of his statement. Restoring the words which have been omitted by the ellipsis, this is the complete quotation of what Einstein actually said. Quote, "I honor Lenin as a man who completely sacrificed himself and devoted all his energy to the realization of social justice. I do not consider his methods practical, but one thing is certain, men of his type are the guardians and restorers of humanity," end quote. It is clear that the words removed were taken away in order to give the false appearance that Einstein was uncritically in favor of Lenin's ideology and methods. In reality, Einstein disagreed completely with Lenin's methods and did not consider them practical. Although he remained committed to socialism throughout his life, Einstein's views on Soviet Russia were far more ambiguous, and fluctuated constantly between critical support and absolute revulsion. This video examines Einstein's views on socialism, covering these topics. 1. Einstein on the Bolshevik Revolution. 2. Einstein on the Soviet Union. 3. Einstein on socialism. 4. Einstein against the US and NATO. Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. Einstein on the Bolshevik Revolution. Although Einstein sympathized with Bolshevism's goals, he was not convinced by Russia's approach to Bolshevism. As early as 1920, in a letter to Max Born, he wrote, quote, "By the way, I must confess to you that the Bolsheviks do not seem so bad to me, however ridiculous their theories. It would be really interesting just to have a look at the thing at close quarters," end quote. In 1925, after having read documentation of the suppression of Stalin's political enemies in an expose by the International Committee for Political Prisoners, Einstein commented, quote, "After the publication of these documents, the rulers of Russia will have to change their methods if they wish to continue their effort to gain moral credibility with civilized nations," end quote, adding that the Russian leadership, quote, "will lose all sympathy if they cannot show, through a great and courageous act of liberation, that they do not need to rely on bloody terror to lend support to their political ideals," end quote. However, Einstein also observed that this kind of suppression was by no means unique to Russia, adding the warning, quote, "If you study these accounts as a reader in a peaceful, well-regulated system of government, don't imagine that those around you are different and better than those who conduct a regime of terror in Russia. Shudder to view this tragedy of human history, where one murders out of fear that one will be murdered. It is the best, the most altruistic who are tortured and killed because their political influence is feared, but not just in Russia," end quote. Just a few years later, Einstein had become even more disillusioned by the Bolsheviks. In a newspaper interview in 1929, Einstein commented, quote, "The Bolshevik experiment may be worth trying, but I think that Russia errs badly in the execution of her ideal," end quote. Einstein's distaste for Bolshevik violence was most likely a product of the fact that he was, in his own words, a, quote, "convinced pacifist," end quote. Einstein wrote that he rejected, quote, "brute force as a means for the solution of international conflicts," end quote, considering that violence was only justifiable when, quote, "a hostile power threatens wholesale destruction of one's own group," end quote. Einstein on the Soviet Union. Einstein's views on the Soviet Union were changeable and conflicting. Historian David Renton, former member of the Socialist Workers' Party, writes that in 1930 Einstein, quote, supported a letter against the show trials, end quote, conducted by Stalin against his political enemies. However, he adds that the following year Einstein retracted his criticism and, quote, in 1937 publicly defended the Moscow trials, end quote. Similarly, political scientists Arthur and Judith Klinghoffer write that in 1936 Einstein commented, quote, from my point of view, both Stalin and Trotsky are political gangsters, end quote. Einstein's views on the Soviet Union seemed constantly in flux throughout the 1930s. In 1932, he refused an invitation to the World Anti-War Congress, an event which was being used by Russian communists to promote the Soviet Union's political interests. In his 6th of June letter refusing to attend the event or sign its manifesto, Einstein wrote, quote, because of the glorification of Soviet Russia, which it includes, I cannot bring myself to sign it, end quote. Einstein explained his view of Soviet Russia with the comment, quote, at the top, there appears to be a personal struggle in which the foulest means are used by power-hungry individuals acting from purely selfish motives. At the bottom, there seems to be complete suppression of the individual and of freedom of speech. One wonders what life is worth under such conditions, end quote. However, in a follow-up letter on the 17th of June 1932, Einstein clarified that he was not against the Russian state itself, writing, quote, you are undoubtedly aware that I agree with you on all essential points. Everything must be done to prevent any external threat to the development of Russia. In my criticism of the appeal, I merely sought to avoid glorification of the internal situation in Russia, end quote. Einstein's conflicted position on Russia was seen again in 1934 when his friend, the anti-communist Isaac Levin, requested his signature on an open letter denouncing Stalin for killing his political opponents. While expressing his dismay with Stalin's actions, Einstein nevertheless refused to sign, writing, quote, you can imagine that I, too, regret immensely that the Russian political leaders let themselves be carried away to deal such a blow to the elementary demands of justice by resorting to political murder. In spite of this, I cannot associate myself with your action. It will have no impact in Russia. The Russians have proved that their only aim is really the improvement of the lot of the Russian people, end quote. However, Einstein's criticism of Russia was not confined to political violence by its leaders. He also had strong views on what constituted a successful socialist state and on the extent to which he believed Russia had succeeded in this regard. In a letter explaining his position in July 1945, he wrote, quote, socializing the means of production, to be sure, does not yet constitute socialism, though it serves as a precondition, end quote. Adding, quote, socialism also requires that concentrated power be under the effective control of the citizenry, so that the planned economy benefits the entire population, end quote. In 1949, Einstein wrote an article in which he differentiated between the Soviet Union's economy and what he considered to be true state socialism, writing, quote, it is necessary to remember that a planned economy is not yet socialism, end quote. He added, very pointedly, quote, a planned economy as such may be accompanied by the complete enslavement of the individual, end quote. A comment which seems to be a scarcely veiled attack on the Soviet government and the state of human rights in Russia at the time. Einstein remained an outspoken supporter of the socialist ideals of the Bolshevik Revolution, even when it was politically dangerous to do so. However, his criticism of the way in which the Russian state was seeking to achieve those ideals seemed to increase over time. By the 1950s, Einstein's views on the Stalinist trials of the 1930s had swung yet again. In an article in the Star Ledger dated the 22nd of January 1953, entitled "Einstein Joins Condemnation of Red Purges," Einstein was quoted stating, quote, "The perversion of justice which manifests itself in all the official trials staged by the Russian government, not only that in Prague, but also the earlier ones since the second half of the 30s, deserves unconditional condemnation," end quote. Einstein died only 2 years later, so it would seem this was his final reflection on the Stalinist purges. Einstein on socialism. Throughout his life, Einstein was an open and dedicated socialist. Although this is exhibited in many of his personal comments, letters, and public statements, it is articulated in particular detail in his 1949 article entitled "Why Socialism?" In this article, published in the socialist magazine Monthly Review, Einstein explicitly makes the case for classical socialism, identifying it as the only solution to the socio-economic evils caused by capitalism. Einstein's anti-capitalist stance is unmistakable in his declaration, quote, "The economic anarchy of capitalist society as it exists today is, in my opinion, the real source of the evil," end quote. Einstein also demonstrated a Marxist understanding of labor in his explanation of how the worker's labor is exploited by the capitalist, writing, quote, "The owner of the means of production is in a position to purchase the labor power of the worker. By using the means of production, the worker produces new goods which become the property of the capitalist," end quote. In his article, Einstein argued, quote, "There is only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy," end quote. However, he did not regard socialism as merely an economic system, but a socio-economic ideology, writing, quote, "Socialism is directed towards a socio-ethical end," end quote. For Einstein, the aim of socialism was fundamentally the improvement of people's living standards and their liberation from oppressive systems. He regarded the aims of socialism as more important to achieve than the construction of specific socialist systems, such as Bolshevism, Marxist-Leninism, or Maoism. This is most likely why he also declared, quote, "I have never been a communist," end quote. Similarly, Einstein was skeptical of economic predictions of what a truly socialist society would look like, asserting, quote, "Economic science in its present state can throw little light on the socialist society of the future," end quote. Einstein against the US and NATO. In 1949, American Vice President Henry Wallace wrote to Einstein seeking his signature on a petition opposing the formation of the North Atlantic Military Alliance, the precursor to the later North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. In his reply, Einstein expressed strongly his objection to the alliance, writing, quote, "The North Atlantic Military Alliance is a horror in my eyes," end quote, and adding, quote, "I have also repeatedly expressed this conviction in public," end quote. Although Einstein agreed with the US involvement in the Second World War and was concerned over Soviet imperialism in post-war Europe, he was an opponent of military escalation as a method of curtailing Soviet expansion. In fact, he believed the West had an obligation to reach out to Russia in diplomacy and invite peaceful interaction. In a letter in 1948, Einstein wrote, quote, "Better to let Russia see that there is nothing to be achieved by aggression, but there are advantages in joining. Then the Russian regime's attitude will probably change, and they will take part without compulsion," end quote. In another letter on the same topic, he wrote, quote, "In my view, it is much better, both morally and practically, to attempt to bring about a state of affairs in which the Russians, out of pure self-interest, find it preferable to give up their separatist position," end quote. However, despite speaking out against this anti-Soviet alliance, Einstein decided not to sign the letter, preferring his activism to be informal rather than aligned with a specific political group. He was also skeptical about the extent to which people would take him seriously as a recent immigrant and a known opponent of American racism and politics. Expressing himself particularly forcefully on this point, he wrote, quote, "On the other hand, I do not feel that I should take that kind of initiative in American politics as indicated in your letter. People do not like to get advice from a comparative newcomer, and I am already well known as an antagonist of the whole imperialistic and half-fascistic attitude of present American politics." End quote. Remember, this is in 1949, and already Einstein was, in his own words, quote, "well known as an antagonist of the whole imperialistic and half-fascistic attitude of present American politics." End quote. This was no exaggeration. Aside from his reputation in the public eye, Einstein was constantly monitored by the FBI, which was both obsessed with him and possibly terrified of him. The extent to which Einstein was seen as a threat is demonstrated by the fact that the FBI's file on him eventually reached 1,427 pages. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover warned that Einstein was, quote, "an extreme radical," end quote. In addition to Einstein's contempt for American imperialism and rising fascism, he was also highly concerned by the rise of anti-communism in America. In 1950, as fears of communism rose to fever pitch, Einstein drew ominous parallels between America and Nazi Germany, writing in a letter to a friend, quote, "Our nation has gone mad. America's obsession with anti-communism and the rising tide of political fear reminds me of the events in Germany," end quote. As if this was not clear enough, he added, quote, "The dear Americans have vigorously assumed the Germans' place. The German calamity of years ago repeats itself," end quote. Einstein was also depressed at the extent to which this trend went without resistance from the public, writing to a friend, quote, "People acquiesce and align themselves with the forces of evil," end quote. But the US was not Einstein's only target in his personal anti-fascist campaign. In 1948, he signed a letter condemning Israel's so-called Freedom Party, identifying the party as, quote, "closely akin in its organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties," end quote, and targeting its leader, Menachem Begin, for particular criticism. The letter noted atrocities and terrorist actions committed against Arabs by the Freedom Party, as well as the Irgun and Stern Gang, two other Zionist terrorist organizations. The letter also noted with dismay that, quote, "the top leadership of American Zionism has refused to campaign," end quote, against Begin and the Freedom Party. Einstein's views on Zionism, his tentative support of the initial Jewish return to Palestine, and his increasing dismay over Zionist colonization and imperialism make for a lengthy and complex story, best explained in a separate video. Conclusion. Despite never aligning himself to any specific party, Einstein was a dedicated and outspoken supporter of socialism, even at the most dangerous of times, risking both political censure and government persecution. Although the American public generally adored him, Einstein was much less appreciated by others, drawing poisonous criticism from a range of opponents. Philosopher Susan Neiman writes, quote, "Einstein was the target of a flood of hate mail," end quote, adding that he was criticized by, quote, "even liberal sources," end quote. The FBI's constant scrutiny of Einstein failed to find justification for his deportation, but Neiman writes it, quote, "did prevent the world's greatest scientist from working on classified defense projects," end quote. This resulted in Einstein being barred from work on the Manhattan Project, which would produce America's first nuclear bombs. In retrospect, Einstein may ultimately have been grateful for Hoover's interference, since he viewed the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with horror, writing, quote, "I have always condemned the use of the atomic bomb against Japan," end quote. The question of Einstein's degree of responsibility for the bomb's creation, and whether or not he would have wished it to be used against Germany, is again a topic for another video. Einstein is a difficult man to analyze. Although his anti-capitalist and socialist views remained firm and well-defined throughout his life, his attitude towards the socialist experiments of the 20th century, especially that of the Bolsheviks and Stalin, were far more ambivalent. In his own analysis of Einstein's socialist views, Renton writes, quote, "The picture that emerges is of a man trapped by the contradictions of his age and unable to find a clear route through the claims of conflicting loyalties," end quote. Yet, despite the inconsistencies of his political loyalties, we may credit Einstein for his consistent personal integrity and dedication to the socialist vision. Finally, I'd like to thank my generous patrons: Elias Asvig, Alexander Curzon, Shawnee Young, Andy Chaos, TBLTP, Niels Rethlin, Matthew Simmerall, Thomas Leonard, Ben Lindquist, John Larkin, Ezekiel Stacey, Love You More, Noah French, Aaron Johnson, Emily Kugler, A. David Johnson, B. The Heretic, Sean M., Waymore Odhi, Aubrey Vaughan, and Magic Turtle. Thank you so much for your support, and please contact me if I ever pronounce your name incorrectly.